The telegram arrived at Whitehaven Mansions on a fog-shrouded Thursday morning in late October, its urgent message crackling with the particular electricity that only genuine mystery could generate. Hercule Poirot, seated at his precisely arranged breakfast table, paused in the act of sectioning his perfectly boiled egg to examine the yellow paper with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a suspicious diamond. "Sacré!" he exclaimed, his egg-shaped head tilting as those famous little grey cells began their preliminary assessment. "Hastings, mon ami, observe this most extraordinary communication." Captain Hastings, who had been wrestling with his morning paper while attempting to balance his coffee cup with military precision, looked up with interest. The telegram, dispatched from the village of Clockhaven in the Cotswolds, bore a message that would have seemed absurd were it not for the evident desperation in its brevity. "Urgent stop Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood found murdered. Stop all village clocks stopped precisely 9 o'clock. Stop impossible circumstances. Stop your reputation precedes you. Stop please come at once. Stop Inspector Meadows, County Police. Stop." Hastings set down his coffee with a frown that creased his honest features. "All clocks stopped at 9. That's rather extraordinary, isn't it, Poirot? Some sort of mechanical failure, perhaps. Or an electrical storm." Poirot's green eyes gleamed with that particular luminescence that Hastings had learned to recognize as the herald of an intriguing puzzle. The little Belgian detective smoothed his immaculate moustache with one precise finger, a gesture that invariably preceded his most penetrating observations. "Mais non, mon bon ami. You think with the practical mind of the soldier, which is admirable but insufficient for this mystery. Consider, why would Inspector Meadows, whom I have never encountered, feel compelled to emphasize such a detail in an urgent telegram concerning murder? No, this cessation of timepieces, it is not accident. It speaks to me of deliberation, of a mind that seeks to manipulate the very perception of time itself." Poirot arrives. The journey to Clockhaven. Within 90 minutes, they were aboard the morning express to Clockhaven, Poirot having packed his small leather valise with characteristic precision. Each item, his spare collars arranged by subtle gradations of stiffness, his special pomade for the maintenance of his moustache, his diminutive clothes brush positioned at precisely the correct angle, occupied its designated space with mathematical exactitude. As the English countryside rolled past their first-class compartment window, painted in the russets and golds of autumn's final performance, Poirot stared thoughtfully at the passing landscape, his mind already constructing preliminary hypotheses. "Tell me, Hastings," he said suddenly, breaking a contemplative silence, "what do you know of this Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood?" Hastings consulted his mental catalogue of notable personages, a filing system that, while comprehensive regarding military matters and sporting achievements, proved somewhat deficient in matters of society. Gossip. "I'm afraid the name doesn't ring any bells, old fellow. Though Blackwood, wasn't there some industrial family by that name? Textiles, perhaps, or mining? Précisément. The Blackwood fortune was built upon Lancashire cotton mills and Welsh coal mines. Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood was the widow of Sir Reginald Blackwood, who died some 5 years past under circumstances that, while ruled accidental, provoked considerable whispered speculation. She was, by all accounts, a woman of formidable character and considerable wealth, though her charitable endeavors were sometimes questioned by those who found her methods unorthodox." "Unorthodox how?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. She had a reputation for extracting rather more from her charitable committees than many felt strictly necessary for administrative purposes. Nothing proven, you understand, but whispers have a way of accumulating like dust in corners, n'est-ce pas? The train pulled into Clockhaven station at precisely 2:30, and Poirot immediately noted the small crowd of villagers gathered on the platform. Their faces bore that particular expression of mingled excitement and apprehension that accompanies tragedy in small communities, a mixture of genuine sorrow and undeniable fascination with the dramatic disruption of their ordered existence. The gathering of suspects. Initial observations. Inspector Meadows proved to be a tall, angular man with prematurely gray hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time in the elements. His handshake was firm, his manner respectful, but tinged with the skepticism of a practical man confronted with circumstances that defied practical explanation. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank you for responding so promptly. I must confess, this case has me thoroughly perplexed. 26 years with the county police, and I've never encountered anything remotely similar." As they walked through the village toward Blackwood House, Poirot observed everything with his characteristic attention to minute detail. Clockhaven was indeed picturesque, a collection of honey-colored Cotswold stone cottages clustered around a medieval church, their gardens still blooming with late roses and hardy chrysanthemums. But there was something else, something that made the little detective pause and cock his head like an inquisitive bird. "Inspector," he said suddenly, "the clocks. I must see them." Their first stop was the village post office, where Mrs. Pemberton, the postmistress, stood behind her counter with an expression of barely contained hysteria. Above the neat rows of stamps and postal supplies, an ornate Victorian wall clock displayed the time as precisely 9 o'clock, its hands frozen in accusatory stillness. "Stopped, dead at 9 this morning," Mrs. Pemberton declared, wringing her hands with nervous energy. "Just as I was sorting the morning delivery. Gave me such a fright, especially when young Tommy Fletcher came running with news about poor Mrs. Blackwood." They proceeded to the ancient church, where the tower clock, a mechanism that had faithfully marked the hours for over 3 centuries, stood equally motionless. The vicar, Reverend Ashworth, a nervous man with thinning hair and ink-stained fingers, explained that he had first noticed the stopped timepiece when he arrived for morning prayers. "Most extraordinary," he stammered, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. "The mechanism has been maintained regularly, never given us a moment's trouble. And it's not merely here. Every timepiece in the village has ceased at the identical moment." Poirot examined each clock face with intense concentration, though he was careful to touch nothing. His green eyes moved systematically, cataloguing details that escaped less trained observation. "Inspector Meadows," he said finally, "you are absolutely certain that all timepieces ceased at 9 o'clock this morning, not 9 o'clock of the previous evening?" "Quite certain. Multiple witnesses can confirm normal operation until this morning. Mrs. Pemberton heard her grandfather clock chime 8:30, and then silence." "Très intéressant," Poirot murmured, his moustache twitching slightly. "And Mrs. Blackwood, when precisely was she discovered?" "At approximately 10:15 this morning by her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies. The lady was found in her private study, seated at her writing desk. Dr. Thornbury believes she died sometime during the night, possibly between midnight and 2 in the morning, though he cannot be more precise without a complete post-mortem examination." Poirot's eyebrows rose in that characteristic expression that indicated his little gray cells had encountered something of particular significance. So the cessation of the timepieces occurred not at the moment of death, but rather some 7 to 9 hours afterward. Most curious indeed. This suggests a mind of considerable cunning, one that understands both the power of symbolism and the art of misdirection. The first false lead. Blackwood House. As they approached Blackwood House, an imposing Georgian mansion set within extensive grounds, Poirot noticed a small group of people gathered near the front entrance. Even from a distance, he could sense the tension that crackled between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. "The household and interested parties, I presume?" he inquired. Inspector Meadows nodded grimly. "Indeed. And I must warn you, Mr. Poirot, this is far from a harmonious gathering. Mrs. Blackwood was not universally beloved, even among her own family circle. There are old grievances here, financial disputes, and what I suspect are carefully guarded secrets." The group consisted of 5 individuals, each presenting a distinct tableau of grief anxiety, or barely concealed animosity. There was Mr. Gerald Blackwood, the deceased woman's stepson, a man in his 40s with the soft features and expensive clothes of inherited wealth, though his eyes held a hardness that spoke of recent disappointments. Beside him stood Miss Cordelia Ashcroft, Mrs. Blackwood's companion and secretary, a woman of indeterminate age whose plain dress and severe hairstyle could not entirely disguise an underlying intelligence and strength of character. Dr. Marcus Thornbury, the family physician, presented the picture of professional competence tinged with personal concern. A man who had clearly known the deceased for many years and felt her loss keenly. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, was a woman whose grief appeared genuine and profound, her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands speaking of genuine affection for her employer. Finally, there was Mr. Jasper Crowley, Mrs. Blackwood's solicitor, a thin man with sharp features and an air of barely concealed impatience, as if the entire affair were an inconvenient interruption to more pressing legal matters. Poirot's green eyes moved systematically from face to face, cataloguing expressions, noting the subtle interplay of glances, and carefully avoided eye contact. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said with a slight bow, "I am Hercule Poirot. Inspector Meadows has requested my assistance in this most puzzling affair. I trust you will all cooperate fully in my investigation." The response was a chorus of polite assurances, though Poirot noted with interest the varying degrees of enthusiasm, or lack thereof, with which these assurances were offered. Already, his little grey cells were beginning to sort and classify, to build the psychological profiles that would, in time, reveal the truth behind both the murder of Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood and the mysterious affair of the village where every clock stopped at 9. As they prepared to enter the house where the crime had been committed, Poirot felt that familiar stirring of intellectual excitement that accompanied the beginning of a truly complex mystery. Somewhere within the walls of Blackwood House lay the solution to a puzzle that defied conventional logic. A crime that had somehow bent time itself to the will of a murderer possessed of both cunning and a flair for the dramatic. The game, as his methods demanded, would be won not through the examination of physical evidence alone, but through the careful dissection of human psychology, the exposure of hidden motives, and the revelation of those small inconsistencies that, when properly understood, would illuminate the entire truth. The interior of Blackwood House received them with that particular hush which seems to accompany violent death, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock and now exhaled it in whispered echoes. Poirot moved through the entrance hall with his characteristic precision, noting the gleaming surfaces and mathematical arrangement of furnishings that spoke of a mind obsessed with order. A mind not unlike his own, though perhaps lacking the warmth that tempered his own pursuit of perfection. The study lay at the rear of the house, a long room where autumn light filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in sepia tones that seemed appropriate to the tragedy that had unfolded here. Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood remained as she had been discovered, seated at her mahogany desk, her head inclined over a half-completed letter as though she had merely paused in her correspondence to consider a particularly difficult phrase. "Très intéressant," Poirot murmured, circling the desk with the careful attention of a jeweler examining a suspicious stone. The fountain pen lay in her right hand, though the angle of the writing and the position of the inkwell clearly indicated a left-handed writer. "Inspector, you observe the position of this pen. Madame Blackwood was left-handed, yet the pen rests in her right hand, clutched with considerable force. This suggests that in her final moments she reached across her body, perhaps in surprise, perhaps in recognition of something unexpected." Dr. Thornbury stepped forward with professional gravity. "The preliminary examination suggests cardiac failure, Mr. Poirot. Mrs. Blackwood's heart was delicate. I had warned her repeatedly about overexertion. A sudden shock could certainly have triggered such an episode. But it was the grandfather clock in the corner that commanded Poirot's most intense scrutiny. Unlike the other timepieces throughout the village, this one showed subtle signs of tampering. Small scratches around the mechanism, the case slightly ajar. "This cessation of time," he said thoughtfully. "It is not accident, but design. Someone wished this death to be discovered with precisely these theatrical circumstances." His first interview was with Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, whose grief appeared both genuine and profound. Settled in the morning room with a cup of tea she did not touch, she recounted her discovery of the body with trembling voice. "I found her at 10:15, sir. The house was too quiet, if you understand me. Mrs. Blackwood was always an early riser. By 7 she'd be at her desk with her correspondence. When I heard no movement, no bell, I went to check." Her hands twisted in her apron. She was particular in her ways, was Mrs. Blackwood, but she didn't deserve this. Not this. "You heard nothing unusual during the night?" "Nothing, sir. Only the wind in the trees and the hall clock marking the hours until—" She paused, confusion clouding her features. "Well, until it stopped, I suppose." Miss Cordelia Ashcroft presented a stark contrast. Composed, almost unnervingly controlled, her voice steady as she answered Poirot's questions. She had served as Mrs. Blackwood's companion and secretary for 3 years, managing correspondence and charitable activities with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Blackwood was a woman of great intellect, Mr. Poirot, demanding certainly, but fair in her own way. She valued order above all else. Miss Ashcroft's hands remained perfectly still in her lap, though Poirot noted the slight tension in her jaw when she spoke of her employer's unique perspective on charity work. "You retired at what hour last evening?" 10:30, after completing the day's correspondence. Mrs. Blackwood was working on a letter to Mr. Crowley, something about urgent amendments to her will. I heard nothing unusual until Mrs. Davies's screams woke the entire household. Gerald Blackwood entered with the weary belligerence of a man long practiced in disappointment. His expensive clothes could not disguise the shadows beneath his eyes or the slight tremor in his hands as he lit a cigarette. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this tragedy, Mr. Poirot, I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely seek to understand the relationships within this household. Evangeline and I had our differences, I won't deny it. Financial matters primarily. She controlled the family trust with an iron hand, and I felt, well, that's neither here nor there now, is it?" As the interviews progressed, Poirot's little grey cells began constructing their preliminary assessments. Each person presented a carefully crafted narrative, yet beneath the surface lay currents of resentment, fear, and carefully guarded secrets. The stopped clocks were not mere coincidence, but a deliberate message, though whether intended for the police, the household, or some other audience entirely remained to be determined. The morning light filtering through the study's heavy curtains revealed details that had escaped initial observation. Poirot circled Mrs. Blackwood's desk with the methodical precision of a clockmaker examining a delicate mechanism, his green eyes cataloguing every element of the carefully arranged scene. The fountain pen clutched in her right hand drew his particular attention, its angle and position clearly indicating a left-handed writer, yet grasped with the desperate force of someone reaching across her body in surprise or recognition. "Très intéressant," he murmured, noting the half-completed letter beneath her still fingers. The elegant script, slanted leftward with practiced precision, addressed Mr. Crowley with characteristic directness. "You will attend at 9 precisely tomorrow morning. The codicil must be executed without further delay." A small blot marred the phrase "without further," as though the pen had hesitated at some troubling thought. Mr. Jasper Crowley, when summoned to the library, presented himself with the brittle efficiency of a man whose professional composure masked considerable personal irritation. His thin frame radiated impatience as he arranged his papers with unnecessary precision, though Poirot noted the slight tremor in his hands. a detail that suggested the solicitor was more affected by recent events than his manner indicated. "Mrs. Blackwood telephoned me yesterday evening at 7, Crowley explained, his voice carefully modulated to professional neutrality. "She insisted upon signing a codicil this morning at 9 o'clock sharp. The amendments were significant. Miss Ashcroft was to receive a life annuity, the Church Bell Restoration Fund, a substantial bequest, while Mr. Gerald Blackwood's allowance faced considerable reduction. Certain charitable committees were to be dissolved entirely." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "And the reason for such urgency, monsieur?" "She mentioned receiving disturbing correspondence, though she refused to elaborate. Her exact words were that certain parties had betrayed her trust most grievously and would find themselves appropriately rewarded for their deception." Crowley's lips compressed into a thin line. She also indicated her intention to remove Dr. Thornbury as executor, citing concerns about his over-familiarity with certain beneficiaries. Dr. Marcus Thornbury, when interviewed, displayed the complex emotions of a man caught between professional duty and profound personal distress. His weathered hands, steady enough for medical practice, betrayed a slight tremor as he spoke of his long acquaintance with the deceased, a relationship that clearly extended far beyond mere physician and patient. "I had known Evangeline since before her marriage to Sir Reginald," he admitted, his voice carefully controlled. "She was a remarkable woman, brilliant, determined, perhaps too proud for her own good. Her heart condition was genuine, requiring digitalis, though she was inconsistent in following medical advice. She believed her will could overcome any physical weakness. You visited her recently, Doctor?" 2 days ago, for her weekly examination. She seemed unusually agitated, mentioning disturbing correspondence that she wouldn't discuss despite my concerns about stress affecting her condition. His eyes held a mixture of grief and something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. Gerald Blackwood entered the smoking room with the weary belligerence of a man long practiced in disappointment. His expensive clothes could not disguise the shadows beneath his eyes or the slight tremor in his hands as he lit another cigarette with quick, nervous movements. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this tragedy," he began defensively. "I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely seek to understand the relationships within this household. Evangeline and I had our differences, financial matters primarily. She controlled the family trust with an iron hand, and I felt—" He paused, taking a harsh draw from his cigarette. "Well, that's neither here nor there now, is it? The irony is perfect. Every clock in the village stopped to mark her importance. She would have appreciated such theatrical timing." As the interviews progressed, Poirot's little grey cells began constructing their preliminary assessments. The cessation of all village timepieces at 9 o'clock, 7 hours after the estimated time of death, represented not mechanical failure, but deliberate theatre. Someone with both technical knowledge and dramatic flair had orchestrated this impossible circumstance, perhaps to distract from more conventional aspects of the crime. Inspector Meadows appeared in the doorway with grim satisfaction, holding up a small object. "We found this beneath the study window, Mr. Poirot. A monogrammed matchbook, Gerald Blackwood's initials." Hastings exclaimed with satisfaction, but Poirot merely studied the evidence without touching it. "It is the first picture, yes," he said thoughtfully. "But when a picture is hung so straight, I ask who set the spirit level?" His green eyes held that particular luminescence that indicated his little grey cells were already perceiving patterns invisible to others. "The gesture of the stopped clocks belongs to a mind that adores symmetry, mon ami. This is not the work of a man who arrives late and apologizes angrily." The discovery of Gerald Blackwood's monogrammed matchbook beneath the study window created an immediate stir that rippled through the assembled household like a stone cast into still water. Inspector Meadows held the silver-plated evidence with obvious satisfaction, his weathered features brightening with the prospect of a swift resolution. Gerald himself displayed that particular combination of outrage and panic that Poirot had learned to recognize in those who found themselves unexpectedly cornered by circumstance, his expensive cigarette trembling between manicured fingers. "This is absolutely preposterous," Gerald declared, his voice rising with indignation. "Anyone could have dropped that matchbook. I've been smoking in the garden for weeks." Evangeline detested the smell indoors, so I often stepped outside after dinner conversations. That proves nothing whatsoever. But it was Miss Cordelia Ashcroft's reaction that drew Poirot's most intense scrutiny. The composed secretary had gone quite pale, her usually steady hands clasping and unclasping in her lap, with nervous energy that seemed entirely at odds with her customary self-possession. When she noticed his green-eyed attention, she attempted a wan smile that failed entirely to reach her eyes, creating instead an expression of forced composure that spoke volumes to Poirot's experienced observation. "Forgive me, Mr. Poirot," she said with carefully modulated voice. "This entire affair has been most distressing. To think that someone in this very house might have—" She left the sentence deliberately unfinished, though her gaze flickered momentarily toward Gerald with something that might have been calculated fear. Inspector Meadows was clearly prepared to consider the case solved, his practical mind satisfied with the neat arrangement of motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. "The case presents itself quite clearly," he declared with professional confidence. "Mr. Blackwood had compelling financial motive, unrestricted access to the house, and now we have concrete evidence placing him at the scene of the crime." "Mais non, mon ami," Poirot interjected with gentle firmness, his moustache twitching with that familiar gesture of intellectual dissatisfaction. "You construct a house of cards which collapses at the first breath of logical examination. Consider, if Monsieur Giraud wished to murder his stepmother, why would he choose a method requiring such elaborate theatrical preparation? The cessation of every timepiece in the village at precisely 9 o'clock. This is not the desperate work of a man seeking quick financial relief, but the calculated artistry of a mind that appreciates both symbolism and misdirection." Dr. Thornbury stepped forward with professional gravity, his medical bag clutched tightly in weathered hands that betrayed the slight tremor of a man under considerable emotional strain. "Perhaps I should explain about Mrs. Blackwood's medication regimen. She required digitalis for her heart condition, a powerful cardiac stimulant that, administered in excessive doses, could certainly prove fatal. The symptoms would closely resemble natural cardiac failure, particularly in someone with her documented medical history. The implications settled over the room like autumn mist, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with renewed interest as his little grey cells began constructing alternative scenarios, each more complex than Inspector Meadows's straightforward solution. "Who possessed access to these medications, Doctor?" Mrs. Blackwood maintained her supply in the study desk drawer. She was absolutely meticulous about taking her evening dose at precisely 8 o'clock each night. Miss Ashcroft often served as her reminder, as did Mrs. Davies when circumstances required. Gerald certainly knew of the medication's existence, though I cannot definitively say whether he understood its potentially lethal properties when misused. Mrs. Davies, who had been listening from the doorway with increasing distress written across her honest features, suddenly spoke with trembling voice. "She took her medicine last night. Same as always, sir. I witnessed her at 8:30, just before I went to prepare her evening tea service. The bottle was positioned on the desk in its usual location." "And this morning?" Poirot inquired with characteristic gentle persistence. "Still there, sir. Though—" She paused, confusion clouding her weathered features as memory struggled with expectation. "It seemed fuller than I anticipated. Mrs. Blackwood was absolutely particular about her prescribed doses. Never missed one, never took additional medication. But the level in the bottle appeared almost untouched, as though—" This detail struck Poirot as profoundly significant, though he filed it away without immediate comment. Instead, he directed his attention to the grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner, its stopped hands pointing with accusatory precision at 9 o'clock. The mahogany case showed subtle signs of recent interference, small scratches around the mechanism housing, the pendulum positioned with unnatural exactitude that spoke of human manipulation rather than mechanical failure. "Inspector Meadows," he said with sudden decision, "I require a comprehensive technical examination of every stopped timepiece throughout the village. Not merely their faces and obvious mechanisms, but their internal workings, their winding systems, their individual peculiarities. Someone possessing considerable horological knowledge has orchestrated this theatrical display, and such specialized knowledge invariably leaves distinctive traces for those who understand where to look." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose from the entrance hall. Multiple voices raised in frustrated argument, hurried footsteps on polished marble, the unmistakable sound of agitated villagers demanding immediate audience. Mrs. Davies hurried to investigate, returning moments later with obvious distress marking her usually composed demeanor. "It's Mr. Pemberton from the post office, sir, along with several other prominent villagers. They're demanding to know when the clocks will be properly repaired. The baker cannot time his bread properly, the church bells refuse to ring for scheduled services, and the railway station master finds himself in absolute chaos, trying to coordinate schedules with completely unreliable timepieces." Poirot's expression grew thoughtful as he absorbed this development, his little grey cells processing not merely the practical implications, but the profound psychological impact. The stopped clocks extended their influence far beyond mere inconvenience. An entire community had been thrust into temporal chaos, their carefully ordered daily rhythms disrupted by an act of calculated theater that demonstrated intimate understanding of human psychology. "Très intéressant," he murmured, his mustache twitching with renewed intellectual excitement. "Our murderer possesses not merely technical cunning, but a sophisticated appreciation for dramatic effect that borders on the genuinely artistic. This represents not simple crime, mes amis. This is calculated performance, designed to unsettle not merely the immediate household, but the entire social fabric of Clockhaven itself." The implications hung in the study's heavy air like incense, dense with unspoken possibilities and the growing certainty that they faced an adversary whose methods transcended ordinary criminal motivation, reaching instead toward something approaching theatrical genius. The commotion from the entrance hall transformed Blackwood House from a scene of contained investigation into barely controlled chaos. Through the morning room window, Poirot observed the gathering crowd of villagers on the front lawn, their faces bearing expressions that ranged from mounting frustration to genuine bewilderment. At their head stood Mr. Pemberton, the postmaster, whose normally precise demeanor had given way to frazzled desperation as he gestured toward the village church tower, where the ancient clock remained frozen in its accusatory pose. "This cannot continue, Inspector," Pemberton declared as the delegation was admitted to the entrance hall. "The entire village has descended into temporal anarchy. The baker's bread is burning because he cannot properly time his ovens. Mrs. Hartwell missed her connection to London, and even the children arrive late for lessons because families can no longer coordinate their morning routines." Behind Pemberton stood a lean, weathered man whose hands bore the distinctive marks of delicate mechanical work, fingertips burnished to a pale gloss from decades of handling brass wheels and steel springs. This was Silas Webb, Clockhaven's master clockmaker, whose nervous manner and reluctance to meet anyone's direct gaze suggested secrets that extended far beyond professional concern. "Mr. Webb," Poirot addressed him with characteristic gentle authority, "you maintain all timepieces throughout Clockhaven, do you not?" "Aye, sir, for near 30 years now," Webb replied, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of local dialect. "But I've never seen anything like this morning's work. Every mechanism shows identical symptoms, stopped dead at 9 o'clock, but not from any mechanical failure I can identify." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. You have examined them personally. Several, sir. The church clock, the post office timepiece, Mrs. Henderson's mantel clock, all functional when wound again, but someone's been tampering. This pallet pin shows a fresh bite. See the bright mark, Inspector? A thin wedge could hold the anchor from unlocking at the precise instant. Pull it out. Pendulum stops. And what material might accomplish such delicate sabotage? Webb's expression grew troubled. Beeswax, sir. A sliver pressed between palate and escape tooth will hold for hours and leave nigh no mark. The warmth of a clock will soften it. Falls away or may be plucked without fuss. Clean, tidy work. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been listening with growing agitation, suddenly interjected with trembling voice. There was that fellow yesterday afternoon, the one who came about the telephones. He had a printed armband saying County Communications. Very official looking. Asked to check the master clock as a courtesy. Said there were complaints about the line. Inspector Meadows straightened with interest. What fellow? We received no notification of telephone maintenance. Very polite gentleman, wore fine brown gloves and smelled faintly of lavender. Signed the visitor's ledger, but... She paused, dismay replacing certainty. The page is gone, torn clean out. Poirot's moustache twitched with that familiar gesture of intellectual excitement. Here was concrete evidence of premeditation. Someone with both technical knowledge and theatrical sensibility had orchestrated this elaborate performance. And who, Monsieur Webb, purchases beeswax in Clockhaven? Mrs. Hart at the milliner's for blocks, the church for candles, households for polish. Anyone keeping musical instruments, violins need rosin and wax for proper maintenance. Miss Ashcroft, who had been standing quietly near the library door, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of dawning realization. Mr. Poirot, might I suggest something rather extraordinary? The cessation of timepieces was not mere misdirection, but communication. Mrs. Blackwood was absolutely obsessed with punctuality. Every morning at precisely 9 o'clock, she conducted what she called her accountability review, examining household expenses, charitable committee reports, correspondence requiring immediate attention. Her most productive hour, Poirot observed thoughtfully. Indeed, if someone wished to send a message about accountability, about time running out for deception. She left the implication suspended in the morning air. Dr. Thornbury, who had been listening with growing unease, suddenly interjected. There's something else, Mr. Poirot. Mrs. Blackwood had been receiving threatening correspondence for several weeks. Anonymous letters suggesting financial irregularities in her charitable activities had been discovered. She showed me one last Tuesday, though she refused to involve the police. Mrs. Davies, wringing her hands with obvious distress, added another crucial detail. This morning, when I discovered Mrs. Blackwood, her private safe was standing open. She never left it unsecured. Absolutely never. The combination was known only to herself and Mr. Crowley for legal purposes. The contents appeared undisturbed. Yes, sir, though I wouldn't presume to examine her private papers. But she must have been reviewing something of particular importance during her final hours. Poirot's little grey cells processed these revelations with mechanical precision. The stopped clocks were not theatrical flourish, but integral elements in a complex psychological game. A murderer who understood not merely the mechanics of death, but the art of symbolic communication. The anonymous impostor with his brown gloves and lavender scent. The missing ledger page. The precisely timed cessation of village timepieces. Each element suggested a mind of considerable cunning and dramatic sensibility. Mes amis, he announced with quiet authority. We face an adversary whose methods transcend ordinary criminal motivation. This represents calculated performance designed to communicate specific messages to specific audiences. The solution lies not in physical evidence alone, but in understanding the psychological architecture of a mind that appreciates both precision and drama in equal measure. Inspector Meadows nodded grimly. What are your immediate requirements, Mr. Poirot? Find the torn page from the post office ledger if it survives. Inquire at shops for recent purchases of beeswax. Trace any visitor claiming authority over communications or timepieces. And Inspector, I require Mrs. Blackwood's correspondence, particularly any threatening letters she may have preserved. As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Poirot remained in the study, his green eyes moving systematically over the scene. The grandfather clock waited in its corner like a silent witness, its stopped hands pointing with accusatory precision at 9 o'clock. Someone in this very house possessed the technical knowledge, the psychological insight, and the theatrical sensibility to orchestrate such elaborate theater. The game had begun in earnest, and Poirot's little grey cells were already perceiving the distinctive patterns that would, in time, reveal the truth behind both the murder of Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood and the village where every clock stopped at 9. The afternoon brought revelations that transformed Poirot's methodical investigation into something approaching urgency. Inspector Meadows returned with a brown paper packet containing Mrs. Blackwood's preserved correspondence, each threatening letter typed with meticulous precision on expensive stationery. Poirot examined them with characteristic attention to minute detail, his fingertips barely touching the edges as though the paper itself might yield secrets. "They are not the ravings of a hysteric," he observed thoughtfully. "Notice, Hastings, the comma placed outside the quotation marks, the hyphenated today and tomorrow. An old-fashioned typist with continental training. The ribbon shows wear in alternating bands, suggesting someone who economizes by reversing it frequently. And observe, the E strikes faintly. The T sits high upon the line. The most explicit message read, 'At 9 there will be silence, and you shall know what debts are owing. You have taken time that was not yours. The hour will stop you.'" Poirot lifted the envelope to his nose, detecting the faint residual scent of lavender, not overpowering but deliberate, speaking of linen closets and carefully ordered domesticity. Mrs. Davies appeared with trembling hands, clutching Mrs. Blackwood's private ledger retrieved from the opened safe. "She kept meticulous records, sir. Every charitable transaction documented with military precision." But as Poirot examined the leather-bound volume, his green eyes sharpened with interest. Certain entries had been altered, amounts erased and rewritten, committee names changed from Music in the Park Fund to Bell Restoration, sums transferred between accounts with suspicious frequency. "Très intéressant," he murmured, noting that several substantial withdrawals coincided with the anonymous letters' arrival dates. Mrs. Blackwood was not merely a victim, mes amis. She was being systematically blackmailed by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of financial irregularities in her charitable activities. Mr. Crowley, summoned to examine the ledger, grew visibly pale as he reviewed the altered entries. These discrepancies were not reflected in the official documentation I maintained. Mrs. Blackwood sometimes conducted private transactions that bypassed normal legal channels, claiming administrative efficiency required such flexibility. The revelation cast new light on the elaborate theatrical elements surrounding her death. Silas Webb, the village clockmaker, provided crucial technical details when questioned about the beeswax sabotage. "Whoever did this possessed considerable horological knowledge," he explained, demonstrating how thin wedges of beeswax could halt multiple timepieces simultaneously. The timing required precise calculation. Each mechanism would need individual adjustment to stop at exactly 9 o'clock. More significantly, Webb recalled a mysterious visitor the previous afternoon. A lady in dark clothing, spoke little, kept her veil down, purchased a penny box of wax and inquired about cleaning techniques for delicate mechanisms. She had that same lavender scent you mentioned, Mr. Poirot. Miss Ashcroft, when confronted with these revelations, maintained her composed exterior, though her hands betrayed nervous tension as she arranged papers in her portfolio. Mrs. Blackwood believed in efficient administration of charitable funds. If certain percentages were retained for operational expenses, this was standard business practice, not criminal activity. And what percentage might constitute operational expenses, Miss Ashcroft? Her carefully controlled facade wavered momentarily. It varied depending on circumstances. Mrs. Blackwood felt that without proper administrative oversight, charitable organizations would inevitably flounder through inefficiency. Dr. Thornbury provided the final piece of the puzzle when he produced Mrs. Blackwood's digitalis prescription. This bottle should be nearly empty by now, given her prescribed dosage. Yet it remains almost full, suggesting she had not been taking her medication regularly, or perhaps someone wished to create the appearance of natural cardiac failure while ensuring she remained vulnerable to shock. Poirot's little grey cells processed these revelations with mechanical precision. The stopped clocks were not mere theatrical flourish, but integral elements in a complex psychological game designed to expose financial crimes that had remained hidden for years. Someone with intimate knowledge of both Mrs. Blackwood's medical condition and her charitable activities had orchestrated this elaborate performance, using the threat of exposure to drive her toward the fatal stress that triggered her weak heart. The murderer understood that Mrs. Blackwood's obsession with punctuality and order would make the stopped clocks particularly disturbing, Poirot concluded. At 9 o'clock each morning, she conducted her accountability review, examining expenses, correspondence, and financial irregularities. The symbolism was deliberate. Time had stopped for accountability, and her house of carefully constructed deceptions was about to collapse. As evening shadows lengthened across Clockhaven, Poirot recognized they faced an adversary whose methods transcended ordinary criminal motivation. This represented calculated justice rather than simple murder, someone who viewed Mrs. Blackwood's death not as crime but as long overdue correction for systematic betrayal of charitable trust. The game had entered its crucial phase, and tomorrow would bring either resolution or the promised second act of this elaborate theatrical performance. The morning brought revelations that transformed the investigation from methodical inquiry into urgent pursuit. Hastings returned from the market town with information that confirmed Poirot's suspicions about the mysterious county communications visitor. His usually cheerful demeanor had given way to the focused intensity of a man who had uncovered significant deception. "There is no such entity as county communications," he reported with satisfaction. "The regional telephone exchange, postal service, and electrical board have never heard of them. But more significantly, Poirot, I discovered something extraordinary at the local printer's shop." Mr. Finch, the elderly printer, had provided crucial details about a peculiar commission received the previous week. A veiled woman had requested official-looking armbands and letterheads for what she claimed was a theatrical society's production about bureaucracy. She had insisted on specific typography, the same faint E and elevated T that characterized the anonymous letters threatening Mrs. Blackwood. She paid in cash and demanded all proof sheets be destroyed, Hastings continued, producing a crumpled sample. But Mr. Finch kept this one, thinking the typography was particularly unusual. The customer spoke softly, wore a dark veil, and carried that distinctive lavender scent we've encountered repeatedly. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction as the theatrical elements of the crime crystallized into clear patterns. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate performance, complete with costumes, props, and carefully rehearsed timing, transforming murder into dramatic statement about justice and accountability. The breakthrough prompted Miss Ashcroft to request a private interview, her usual composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated deception. In the morning room, she revealed the full extent of the financial conspiracy that had motivated Mrs. Blackwood's murder. Mrs. Blackwood was systematically embezzling from charitable organizations throughout the county. She confessed with quiet desperation. "My role as secretary provided perfect cover. I maintained duplicate records, created false documentation, and ensured that questions were redirected to committees that existed only on paper. She promised to cover my sister's expensive medical treatment in exchange for my administrative flexibility. The confession unfolded with methodical precision, revealing years of sophisticated financial manipulation. Mrs. Blackwood had used her social position to establish trust funds that enriched her personal accounts while maintaining the appearance of charitable administration. The elaborate documentation discovered in her safe represented not legitimate charity work, but evidence of systematic fraud spanning nearly 5 years. 3 months ago, the anonymous letters began arriving with specific transaction details that only someone with intimate knowledge could have compiled. Mrs. Blackwood became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone in the household was betraying her. The night she died, she received a telephone call at 11 o'clock, speaking in increasingly agitated tones. Afterward, she summoned me and declared her intention to confess everything to the authorities the following morning. Poirot absorbed these revelations with characteristic attention to psychological detail. The stopped clocks throughout Clockhaven were not mere theatrical flourish, but integral elements in a moral reckoning that extended far beyond simple criminal justice. Someone had orchestrated Mrs. Blackwood's psychological destruction with the precision of a master dramatist, using her own guilt and medical vulnerabilities as weapons. As Miss Ashcroft's confession concluded, a commotion erupted from the entrance hall. Multiple voices raised in alarm, hurried footsteps on polished marble. Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway with obvious distress, her usually steady hands trembling as she clutched a telegram. "Another message, sir," she announced with barely controlled panic. "Delivered to the front door just now, though no messenger was seen." The telegram bore the same expensive stationery and distinctive typography. "The second hand moves at 10. Those who enable deception will find their time equally measured. Justice requires witnesses." The implications settled over the morning room like gathering storm clouds. Their adversary was not finished with theatrical performances. This represented escalation, a promise of further dramatic revelations designed to expose every participant in Mrs. Blackwood's elaborate financial conspiracy. "Mes amis," Poirot announced with quiet authority. "We approach the crucial moment when all deceptions must collapse under the weight of accumulated truth. Our murderer possesses not merely technical cunning, but sophisticated understanding of human psychology, using guilt and fear as precisely as any physical weapon. The stopped clocks were merely the opening act in a performance designed to force complete confession and moral reckoning." Inspector Meadows appeared with grim determination. "What are your instructions, Mr. Poirot?" "Assemble everyone in the library at precisely 10 o'clock. Our theatrical director has promised a second act, and I believe we shall witness the final revelation of this elaborate moral drama. But, Inspector, ensure that no one leaves Blackwood House unaccompanied. The performance is not yet complete, and our adversary has demonstrated considerable dedication to dramatic timing." The morning light filtering through the windows carried with it the promise of revelations that would soon transform this complex web of deception into crystalline clarity, though at what cost remained to be determined. The library at Blackwood House had transformed into a theatrical stage as 10 o'clock approached, each participant positioned with the careful precision of actors, awaiting their final cues. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face, cataloguing the subtle expressions that revealed far more than carefully constructed words ever could. The grandfather clock in the corner remained frozen at 9, its stopped hands serving as constant accusation in the heavy silence. Gerald Blackwood occupied the leather armchair nearest the window, his expensive cigarette trembling between manicured fingers as he projected casual indifference that fooled no one present. Miss Ashcroft sat rigidly upright on the settee, her recent confession having stripped away the composed facade, leaving behind only hollow-eyed exhaustion. Dr. Thornberry stood beside the medical texts, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in professional detachment, though the slight tremor in his shoulders betrayed profound personal investment. Mrs. Davies remained near the door, her honest features marked by growing apprehension as she began comprehending the conspiracy's full scope. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with characteristic precision, "we gather to witness the conclusion of a performance that began not with Mrs. Blackwood's death, but with her systematic betrayal of charitable trust throughout this community. The stopped clocks were not random theatrical flourish, but calculated symbols communicating accountability's moral weight." He moved to examine the water decanter on the side table, lifting it delicately to his nose. "Lavender," he murmured thoughtfully. "The signature of our theatrical director, who appreciates continuity in performance." Setting it aside untouched, he continued, "Someone with intimate knowledge of both horological mechanisms and human psychology orchestrated this elaborate theater, using Mrs. Blackwood's guilt and medical vulnerabilities as weapons more effective than any physical instrument." The mantel clock's hands approached 10 with agonizing deliberation. As if responding to some invisible conductor's baton, a soft mechanical clicking emanated from the grandfather clock's case. The stopped pendulum trembled, lifted, and began its measured swing. With the first tick, a small envelope slipped from behind the clock's face, floating to the carpet with theatrical precision. "The second act," Poirot observed calmly as Inspector Meadows reached for the message. The paper bore familiar typography. "Justice requires witnesses. The enabler's time has come." Dr. Thornbury stepped forward instinctively, reaching for the water decanter with medical reflex. Poirot intercepted him with surprising swiftness, striking the glass from his hands. It shattered against the fireplace grate, dark liquid splashing across stone and running toward cold ashes. "Digitalis gives its message to the tongue only for those who know how to listen," Poirot explained, touching the wet stone briefly to his fingertip. "The bitterness is unmistakable, though the lavender scent was meant to distract from closer examination." Mrs. Davies gasped with genuine horror. "I prepared nothing, sir. That decanter has stood untouched since morning." "Since 9:45, when you arranged the tea service," Poirot corrected gently. "Not accusation, madame, but observation. Someone used your innocent movements to position this final theatrical element." Before anyone could respond, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. Silas Webb burst through the doorway, his face flushed with exertion and discovery. "Mr. Poirot, the church bell struck of its own accord. Someone had rigged the escapement with beeswax to release at precisely 10 o'clock. I found a thin gut string connecting the mechanism to the bell rope, designed to pull free when the pallet slipped." He produced a delicate hat pin with cloudy purple glass head. "Found this in the belfry dust, along with a torn ledger page listing payments to a bell restoration committee that never existed. The pin reeks of lavender oil." Poirot's mustache twitched with intellectual satisfaction as the final pieces aligned. Our murderer possesses vanity alongside cunning, unable to resist over-ornamentation that ultimately betrays. The elaborate timing mechanisms, the false evidence deliberately planted, the symbolic communications, all demonstrate a mind that views murder not as crime, but as moral theater requiring appropriate audience. He surveyed the assembled faces with renewed intensity. The digitalis in the decanter was intended to create a second victim before witnesses, completing the performance with dramatic symmetry. But our theatrical director made one crucial error, the assumption that justice and revenge are synonymous concepts. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time that had been stolen and now returned. Outside, villagers gathered in the lane, their faces lifted toward the church tower where normal time had finally resumed. The final act approached, and Poirot's little gray cells hummed with anticipation of confronting a mind that had elevated murder into art, transforming an entire village into a stage for elaborate moral reckoning. The grandfather clock's resumed ticking echoed through the library like a metronome marking the final movements of an elaborate symphony, each measured beat drawing the assembled suspects closer to an inevitable crescendo of revelation. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace with characteristic precision, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face as his little grey cells processed the intricate web of deception that had culminated in Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood's theatrical demise. The methodical unraveling. The shattered decanter speaks eloquently of our murderer's final performance. Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Digitalis dissolved in water, scented with lavender to mask the bitter taste, a weapon chosen not for convenience but for symbolic resonance. Our theatrical director understood that Mrs. Blackwood's death alone would not satisfy the demands of moral justice. The performance required witnesses, carefully orchestrated revelations, and the systematic exposure of every participant in her elaborate financial conspiracy. He moved to examine the fragments of glass scattered across the hearthstones, noting how the liquid had spread in patterns that spoke of deliberate preparation rather than spontaneous poisoning. The technical sophistication required for village-wide temporal manipulation, the intimate knowledge of Mrs. Blackwood's routines and vulnerabilities, the psychological insight necessary to orchestrate her systematic torment, these elements could not have originated from a single mind, regardless of how cunning. Dr. Thornbury stepped forward with professional composure, though the slight tremor in his weathered hands betrayed emotional investment that extended far beyond medical duty. His shoulders sagged slightly under Poirot's penetrating gaze, the weight of accumulated deception finally overwhelming professional dignity. The medical accomplice revealed. Dr. Thornbury, Poirot continued with gentle authority, your father was Clockhaven's clockmaker before Silas Webb assumed the position. You learned horological mechanisms as a boy, understanding precisely how thin wedges of beeswax could halt multiple timepieces simultaneously. The coordination required months of careful study, examining each mechanism throughout the village to plan the synchronized sabotage that would stop every clock at exactly 9 o'clock. The doctor's composed facade began cracking under relentless analysis. You possessed intimate knowledge of Mrs. Blackwood's medical vulnerabilities, her charitable activities, and her obsessive morning routine. More significantly, you understood that her guilt over systematic embezzlement had created psychological conditions ripe for cardiac crisis. When you discovered the extent of her financial crimes during routine examination of charitable committee records, your medical training in systematic analysis revealed patterns of theft that had escaped less methodical scrutiny. The anonymous letters, Dr. Thornbury admitted with clinical precision, were composed on the typewriter in my surgery office. The distinctive E and elevated T that characterized my prescription labels, the lavender scent from sachets I used to mask medicinal odors in my consulting room, I orchestrated her psychological torment with the precision of a master physician, using her own guilt as the instrument of destruction. The true mastermind. Exposed. But Poirot's attention had shifted to Miss Cordelia Ashcroft, whose composed exterior could no longer conceal the cold intelligence that had orchestrated the conspiracy's most sophisticated elements. Her hands remained perfectly still in her lap, though her eyes held a burning resentment that spoke of profound personal betrayal. Miss Ashcroft, Poirot observed with characteristic precision, your recent confession regarding financial complicity was most illuminating, though incomplete. You spoke of Mrs. Blackwood's unique perspective on charity work, with bitterness that belied your composed exterior. You were far more than mere accomplice. You were the architect of the false records, the shadow administrator who knew every detail of her systematic betrayals. The secretary's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled, revealing the formidable intellect that had remained hidden beneath years of professional subservience. She promised me everything, Mr. Poirot. Financial security for my sister's medical treatment, a future free from endless struggle. When her schemes began unraveling, she threatened to expose me, to destroy my sister's last hope for proper care. She was a monster who deserved to confront the absolute weight of her deceptions. The complete conspiracy. The collaboration was inevitable, Poirot explained, his mustache twitching with intellectual satisfaction. Dr. Thornbury provided the medical knowledge and horological expertise, while Miss Ashcroft contributed intimate understanding of the financial crimes and access to Mrs. Blackwood's correspondence. Together, you orchestrated not simple murder, but elaborate moral theater designed to expose corruption while ensuring your own survival. The confession unfolded with methodical precision, revealing months of careful coordination. Miss Ashcroft had typed the anonymous letters on Mrs. Blackwood's own machine, using the worn ribbon she so carefully economized, while Dr. Thornbury had gradually reduced her digitalist dosage to ensure maximum vulnerability to psychological stress. The stopped clocks represented their joint masterpiece, a symbolic statement that Mrs. Blackwood's time for deception had ended, orchestrated with technical precision that only their combined expertise could have achieved. Justice and resolution. Inspector Meadows stepped forward with professional authority, his expression showing grudging respect for the elaborate planning involved. Dr. Thornbury, Miss Ashcroft, you're both under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the conspirators were led away, their weathered features bore expressions of profound sadness rather than criminal defiance. They had viewed themselves as moral surgeons removing cancerous corruption, not as murderers destroying human life. The elaborate theatrical elements, the stopped clocks, the symbolic timing, the carefully orchestrated revelations represented their attempt to transform necessary justice into public education about charitable fraud. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time that had been stolen and now returned to normal flow. Outside, villagers began the process of resetting their timepieces, restoring temporal order to a community that had been thrust into chaos by two individuals whose vision of dramatic justice had ultimately consumed them both. The final act had concluded, though its implications would resonate through Clockhaven's charitable organizations for years to come, serving as a permanent reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions must eventually yield to the inexorable passage of time and the persistent application of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The library emptied with the measured solemnity of a theater after the final curtain, each participant departing with the weight of revelation settling upon their shoulders like autumn mist. Inspector Meadows supervised the arrests with professional thoroughness, though his weathered features reflected the complex emotions that accompanied cases where justice and criminality intertwined in morally ambiguous patterns. Miss Ashcroft rose with characteristic efficiency, arranging her gloves on the table's edge with the same meticulous precision that had concealed her criminal activities for years. She looked once at the shattered decanter, then surrendered her wrists without protest, her composed facade finally cracked to reveal the formidable intellect beneath. Dr. Thornbury removed his spectacles and attempted to polish them, but his hands trembled too violently for the lenses to clear. The weight of his betrayal, not merely of Mrs. Blackwood, but of his medical oath and the community's trust, had finally overwhelmed his professional composure. As the constables led them away, both conspirators bore expressions of profound sadness rather than criminal defiance, having viewed themselves as moral surgeons removing cancerous corruption rather than murderers destroying human life. Poirot's final deductions. "There remains one question, Inspector," Meadows said, his voice holding grudging awe for the elaborate conspiracy they had unraveled. "The poisoned decanter, who was meant to die before we could intervene." Poirot's green eyes moved to the vacant chair positioned precisely beside the water service. Monsieur Crowley would have occupied that seat, had punctuality not been disrupted by our investigation. His habitual 10 o'clock appointment to discuss legal affairs, the glass placed at his right hand, the note timed for his arrival. Miss Ashcroft knew his routine with secretary's precision. The solicitor, who had unknowingly drafted structures that concealed theft, would die to complete their allegory of accountability. "You cannot claim I knew of the embezzlement," Crowley protested, his face pale as parchment. "I believed her charitable funds entirely legitimate." "Précisément, monsieur," Poirot replied with gentle authority. "You were the instrument that did not question why it sounded so smoothly. It is not crime to sign documents when one is deceived, but it proved very dangerous to your continued existence. Our theatrical directors required a final act that would expose every participant in the conspiracy, willing or unwitting." Hastings, who had been following the explanation with military attention to detail, frowned thoughtfully. But surely the technical aspects alone would have challenged even their combined expertise. "Mais non, mon ami." Dr. Thornberry's father was Clockhaven's clockmaker before Silas Webb assumed the position. The doctor learned horological mechanisms as a boy, understanding precisely how thin wedges of beeswax could halt multiple timepieces simultaneously. The coordination required months of careful study, examining each mechanism throughout the village to plan the synchronized sabotage that would stop every clock at exactly 9 o'clock. The complete conspiracy revealed. Poirot moved to examine the grandfather clock, its resumed ticking marking time's return to natural order. The collaboration was inevitable once they discovered the scope of Mrs. Blackwood's embezzlement. Miss Ashcroft provided intimate knowledge of the financial crimes and access to correspondence, while Dr. Thornberry contributed medical expertise and technical cunning. Together, they orchestrated not simple murder, but elaborate moral theater designed to expose corruption while ensuring their own survival. The complete financial records, now spread across Inspector Meadows's desk, revealed the staggering scope of Mrs. Blackwood's systematic theft. Over £40,000 had been diverted from legitimate charitable organizations during 5 years of elaborate deception, with false committees and fabricated administrative expenses concealing the embezzlement from even careful scrutiny. The Bell Restoration Fund alone lost nearly £8,000 that never reached the church coffers, Inspector Meadows reported grimly. The Music in the Park Fund, the Children's Hospital Committee, the Widows' Relief Society, half of these organizations existed only on paper, created to justify financial transfers that enriched her personal accounts. Village restoration and character fates. As evening settled over Clockhaven, Silas Webb moved through the village with tender precision, removing beeswax slivers from clock mechanisms and restoring temporal order to a community thrust into chaos by elaborate theatrical performance. At the church, he and Reverend Ashworth reset the tower clock to Greenwich time with ceremonial gravity. "It is not the hours we lost," the vicar observed to Poirot, gazing up at the honest dial. "It is the confidence in our charitable institutions." "Courage, mon père," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Time is patient. It resumes its pulse because the human heart insists upon order, even after discovering that those we trusted have betrayed that very principle." Gerald Blackwood emerged from the study with obvious relief. The weight of suspicion finally lifted from his shoulders. The discovery of his stepmother's systematic embezzlement had paradoxically cleared his name while revealing the true scope of corruption that had motivated her theatrical demise. "The irony is profound," he reflected with bitter satisfaction. Evangeline spent years lecturing about fiscal responsibility and charitable duty, while systematically betraying every principle she claimed to represent. Her death was poetic justice, though I cannot condone the methods employed to achieve it. Mrs. Davies, her honest features still marked by emotional turmoil, began the process of cataloguing Mrs. Blackwood's effects for legal disposition. The revelation that her respected employer had conducted elaborate criminal activities under the guise of charitable administration had shattered her faith in the ordered household she had served with such dedication. Philosophical reflection and departure. As the evening express prepared for departure, Poirot reflected upon the case's moral complexities with characteristic philosophical detachment. The affair at Clockhaven had demonstrated the dangerous consequences when righteous anger corrupts moral judgment, transforming legitimate concerns about charitable fraud into personal vendetta that ultimately consumed its perpetrators. The criminal mind often believes itself the most clever, the most original, he mused to Hastings as their train pulled away from the station. But truth has a way of asserting itself, like persistent weeds pushing through concrete. The more elaborate the deception, the more fragile its foundations become. Behind them, the village began its slow healing process, the stopped clocks now marking time's inexorable passage, while serving as permanent reminder that even the most sophisticated deceptions must eventually yield to persistent investigation and unwavering pursuit of justice. The grandfather clock in Blackwood House continued its steady rhythm, its resumed ticking a testament to order restored and time reclaimed from those who had sought to manipulate its very essence for theatrical effect. In his comfortable compartment, Poirot settled back with satisfaction tempered by melancholy. Justice had been served, though at considerable cost to all involved parties. The village where every clock stopped at 9 would remain in his memory, as proof that human nature contains depths that even his penetrating little gray cells could not fully illuminate. A reminder that in the complex interplay between righteousness and revenge, the line between justice and criminality often proves as delicate as the mechanism of a perfectly crafted timepiece. Epilogue. The next morning's newspapers would carry headlines about the Clockhaven conspiracy, though they could never capture the full complexity of a case where moral outrage had transformed respectable citizens into theatrical murderers. The charitable organizations throughout the county would implement new oversight procedures, ensuring that future Mrs. Blackwoods could not exploit their positions with such devastating effect. And in the village itself, whenever residents checked their timepieces, they would remember the morning when every clock stopped at 9, a reminder that time, seen like trust, once broken, requires patient reconstruction by those who understand that true order emerges not from deception, but from the persistent application of honest principle and unwavering moral courage.